Ethics and Accountability Code for Nonprofit Organizations in Pennsylvania. Her background includes work in the fields of education and nonprofit administration. Currently, Tish also serves as an adjunct faculty for Eastern University's Master's Program in Nonprofit Management. So, thank you, Tish, very much. So, this is the face behind the voice you might be talking to.
So does everybody see Stephanie Taylor up here? That's probably because I did the last session with Stephanie Taylor, and when I did the PowerPoint, I didn't take that off, and no R in the last name. That's what, I'd like to emphasize that because people put R's in my first and last name. Trish Mogan, I get all the time. Okay, this is about taking a 3-credit business ethics grad course for students in nonprofit management into 10 minutes. So it'll be the highlights of everything. And in terms of building an ethical culture, I work with the Standards for Excellence. It's all about ethics and accountability. But this is beyond that, or it's actually the heart and the depth of where it comes from. And in terms of my own learning about the impact of ethics, I use a lot of Jim Collins' work, which he has written books about successful and visionary companies that have now failed. And my contention with a lot of other people is it's not because the characteristics he identified were not correct, because the leadership changed and the culture changed. And I truly believe in his ingredients for what makes a strong, profitable, long-lasting, for-profit corporation that also apply to nonprofit corporations. And the bottom line, I used to use his work in the grad course I taught on business ethics, and the bottom line when you read his books is he totally turns upside down or inside out the business ethics paradigm that I was brought up on, that I learned in my MBA studies, which is it's either, business ethics is an oxymoron. You're either ethical or you make a profit. And that was the textbooks, that was everything. Jim Collins has turned that inside out in that the lesson you bring away from his writings and his study and his research are the stronger the culture of ethics within a corporation, for-profit, non-profit. For-profit, the more profit you will make. Non-profit, the more mission we can achieve. And my experience of administrating a nonprofit at one point in my life is, do we really think about ethics when we're worrying about how our board's acting, we do. We all have that ethical component. But this is now about being intentional in terms of building a culture that is strongly focused on ethics. So it's the intention that we're looking at as we move into working in whatever organization it is. So, where does this all start in terms of having that intention of building culture of ethics? And this is where it starts with us as individuals. It's our own identifying. What is our own personal ethic? When I ask students to share, what are their key values, some of them are similar, some of them are very different. But it's a matter of, are we really clear ourselves what we hold as our absolute truths? And then we move into, well, then there's the ethics in the organization, and then we look at the ethics of the nonprofit sector as a whole, okay? So there's 3 different levels, there's circles, if we can picture them. But this is where I'd like to share a personal story in terms of my own personal ethic. Okay, 2nd generation German, 2nd generation Irish in terms of parents, okay? My mother, the most loving person in the world, and loved us to death and gave us that great gift. But growing up, little white lies were okay. I went to Catholic school, and on December 8th, those of us who might have that background, Catholic holiday, Immaculate Conception, I'm from Philly area, everybody went to Philly for the John Wanamaker Christmas show and all that kind of stuff. My mother would not step near it. She used to work in the city. She wasn't going to be with all those crowds. Okay, so a week later, sisters would get a note. Dear sister, Justine and Patricia have a doctor's appointment and they need to leave at noontime. And so we would leave at noontime, we'd get on the train, go down to Philly, have a great time. So those kinds of things, you know, little white lies were okay. Well, I get into an adulthood and little white lies are okay. But I got into a situation where I was working with a group of women and we were working on this big art project and there was this room that was off limits of all these donated art supplies because they were for something else. Well, there was something in there I needed. And I managed to get it. And I got caught. That situation, well, you know, in terms of the position that I was in at the time, it blew me away so much that from my experience, I said, I'm never doing that again. I'm sure we have similar stories of the things that I'm not doing that again. So the formation of our own personal ethic is evolutionary. Anybody here born into a perfect family? Yeah. Most of us have some kind of dysfunction, and that's where we learn through our adult lives and maybe years of therapy or whatever in terms of how to deal with, we're never going to get rid of them completely. We're never going to be perfect, but we form a stronger personal ethic. So we want to identify what that is. And then, you know, in terms of, what are my definitions? There's several definitions of ethics. You know, what are ethics? I love this one. Obedience to the unenforceable. It's like I'm teaching a business ethics course and I moved to Central Pennsylvania to take the PANO job and I buy $280 worth of stuff at the Home Depot and I come out and I'm unloading all the stuff into my car and I just, oh shoot, there's a pair of $3 garden gloves that I didn't put out on the cash register. All right, my former, oh good, you know, just shove them in the car, they can just charge for that. Every day, working with an ethics program, walk back into the Home Depot, pay the $3 for the garden gloves. So it's obedience to the unenforceable. And then these are the list of things where, you know, in terms of your own reflection, think about your own ethics. Go inside yourself. You know, where are the things and what influenced you the most? And that's where, yeah, my family did in good ways. There's some strong positive ethics, but also in not so good ways. And the whole, you know, friends and peers, but experience is one of the key things in terms of how we form what is important to us, and certainly the media today, you know, in terms of forming national ethics that we're displaying left and right in terms of what we think is right and wrong. And that's where when I go back to in terms of, you know, forming our ethics, and some people have very strong roles. But when we look at this from a world perspective, and please excuse the non-inclusive language there, I took this from a text which you're going to see a citation for later, in terms of this is what we know as the universal ethic, right? Every single major religion has this golden rule, this universal ethic, and that's where I say, so why do we keep killing each other? Which we do, right, in terms of look at the world today. And where does that come from? It comes from, my God's better than your God. My interpretation of how to do this is better than your interpretation of how to do that. So it goes back to the things we've heard on leadership, you know, in terms of opening ourselves up, and this bring it down to the workplace. My idea is better than your idea, all right? And in terms of guarding against that absolute authority, because look what that leads us into. You know, we look at stories in our sacred scriptures that have that, and that's my theology group, so I'm not going to go into that right now, but there's a whole explanation of where those things came from. And that's not where I believe our true religious leaders want us to go in terms of embracing, again, bring it back to the workplace, creating a culture of ethics and what that says to us. I always like to point out the cultural influences. You know, Western culture, we're very black and white, Greco-Roman, dualistic. You know, it's either good or it's bad, male or female, you know, where all of that came from. Whereas Eastern is much more of the holistic, and I think that's where we're all headed these days in terms of blending the best from both cultures. You know, what this also led to, utilitarianism, without going into a whole ethics course here, is the fact that businesses formed an ethic out of this black or white, good or bad, cost-benefit analysis. Business brought that into their cultural ethics. And Ford, dying in a Pinto, the few might be old enough to remember this, I do, in terms of Ford's choice. There was a defect in the Pinto bottle, and it came down to an $11 part that needed to be replaced. Well, Ford did a cost-benefit analysis of putting that $11 part into all of the cars that were already out there. And it was going to cost them somewhere about $11 million. Then they did the cost of a life. And the number of people that were actually killed or harmed were somewhere around 100, but they used life insurance as a calculator, and it came to 1.5 million. And they made the decision not to replace the part because of the cost. This became the first corporate example of a corporation being found accountable and sued. And there's a lot of this material is from Managing Business Ethics, straight talk about how to get it right. I'll have the citation at the end. But there's amazing stories that wakes up our awareness of how did we ever get there in that ethical culture. And so it's always looking at, you know, being on guard about taking things for granted from an ethical perspective. You know, we do things every day. This is the way we do it. We have to develop that, whether it's, you know, self-awareness, sensitivity to what's the best indicator of whether it's good or not. Gut. You know, paying attention to those gut feelings. The guy, I'm trying to think of the guy's name that actually was responsible for this, and 20 years later wrote an article about his whole reflection on this whole experience. He was the manager in the department that was responsible for making the decisions. And this is where what he learned to do himself from this was to pay. He knew, before he went to Ford, he was a social justice person. And he had this strong social justice crusade for his personal life. He got into this, and this is the way they did things, and it didn't bother his conscience until, you know, the whole thing blew up. So I think the point is we need to pay attention to that. There is a gender note to ethics and values, and I think we all experience this, and it's not to say that all women do things this way and all men do things this way. We're androgynous. You know, we both have the male tendencies and the female tendencies. However, there is an overall, and we've all, you know, heard men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and I use it from the cave people in terms of the male being the hunter and gatherer, and the female being, men being hunter and the female being the gatherer. And we do tend to, you know, women network naturally. I remember about 20 years ago, it was the, you know, brand new thing in business thinking was, you know, networking. Yeah. And, you know, and then that's where, in terms of looking at, just being aware of those differences, and that's increasing. And I look at, you know, we mentioned hierarchical, you know, in terms of, well, wait a minute, there's circles, you know, and Jacob's ladder, how to get to heaven, versus Sarah's circle in terms of the gatherer. So lots more could be said, but from an organizational ethic, we want to look at how we address problems, how we're intentional about the culture, and how do our products and services align with those types of things. So we look, it does involve everybody. A shareholder, who's that? Anybody that's involved with our organizations. in terms of, even our vendors, in terms of how we treat all people with that type of consistent, in terms of, when we say, what is culture? I think we know, our families have culture, right? We build culture around food, meals, and it's the way we do things in our workplace, strongly influenced by leadership. And in terms of, since the 1990s, ethics programs in for-profit corporations have catapulted, and especially the last 10 years with Enron, WorldCom, things like that. But it's aligning all of our systems to support. And what are the systems? And there is a resource that will be on our website. If you want to do an audit of your ethical culture, I've gotten permission to use this from Karen Nelson and Linda Trevino, authors of the book. Linda Trevino, by the way, was Dean of the Smeals College of Business at Penn State University. Went to work her university-wide in terms of looking at how you would do, and what it takes care of is, let me get through this one. Here are the formal systems that make up our culture, how we hire, how we make those choices, how we orient, and these are the informal, the talk around the water cooler. What's that atmosphere? What's okay to talk about? What's the tone? In terms of, what our rituals are, who do we celebrate? So the ethical audit asks questions around all of those systems. And last, the thing I'd like, this is Linda Trevino, by the way, she's sources up there. And this is where she had 5 business ethic things. It's easy. We look up and around for all our ethical decisions in terms of 80%. We look at its result of bad apples. If you have a strong ethical culture, a bad apple is going to get spotted and pulled out of the barrel. There's something wrong with the barrel from a system that's formed. In terms of, we can become, this doesn't happen. This is relational. In terms of, again, as we say, intentional. In terms of, it's mostly about leader integrity. Leader has to, I can be full of integrity. Leader has to address that same call throughout the organization. And less ethical than they used to be, not so. I say, Cain and Abel, we will always have with us. All right, Adam and Eve, it's age old. But what is changing is, first of all, the publication of it, and in terms of, we're not anymore, it's just the vehicles that we have expanded, to be unethical, have expanded. So last thing is name and live, personal ethic, be intentional about defining it and living it in the organization, and always support. For the last thing, which this is my life and my passion, and raising the bar for the nonprofit sector. In terms of, I get the great gift of working with the Standards for Excellence program to do that. So that's it.